British inquiry finds that Russian President Vladimir Putin probably approved the 2006 murder in London of ex-KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko with radioactive plutonium-210. Amid renewed tensions between Washington and Jerusalem, Prime Minister Netanyahu meets with U.S. Vice President Biden and Secretary of State Kerry at the Davos summit. And the Palestinian Authority is pushing for a UN Security Council resolution that would declare Israeli settlements in the West Bank illegal under international law. Good evening and welcome to the weekend edition of the news today. Our top story tonight. A British inquiry has found that Russian President Vladimir Putin probably approved a 2006 operation to murder ex-KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko in London. Moscow, which declined to cooperate in the inquiry, described the handling of the case as opaque and biased. Danny Swibel reports.
A British inquiry into the 2006 killing in London concluded on Thursday that the killing of former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko was probably approved by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Litvinenko, an outspoken critic of Putin who fled Russia, died at the age of 43 after drinking green tea laced with a rare radioactive isotope at London's Millennium Hotel. An inquiry led by British judge Robert Owen found that former KGB bodyguard Andrei Lugovoy and another Russian Dmitry Kovtun poisoned Litvinenko as part of an operation directed by Russia's Federal Security Service, the main heir to the Soviet-era KGB.
I have concluded that there is a strong probability that when Mr. Lugovoy poisoned Mr. Litvinenko, he did so under the direction of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation.
The death of Litvinenko marked a post-Cold War low point in Anglo-Russian relations, and ties have yet to recover. British Home Secretary Theresa May said the government would summon Russia's ambassador, impose asset freezes on named suspects, and that international arrest warrants were in place.
This was a blatant and unacceptable breach of the most fundamental tenets of international law and of civilized behavior.
The Kremlin continues to deny any involvement, and this latest development provoked immediate censure from Moscow. Russia's foreign minister said what it called Britain's politicized, biased, and opaque handling of the Litvinenko case had clouded relations. Both of the former bodyguards have previously denied involvement, and Russia has refused to extradite them. Lugovoy was quoted by the Interfax news agency as saying the accusation was absurd.
And joining me now is Jonathan Sasha, I24 News London correspondent. Good evening, Jonathan.
Good to be with you.
Jonathan, could you tell us first, why did this inquiry take as long as it did?
The inquiry is a particularly sensitive one because, of course, the case that's being dealt with is one of nothing less than nuclear mini-terrorism on the streets of London. Given that that's the case, and the fact that this is at the hands of potentially Vladimir Putin himself, the report having said that he is probably someone who authorized the killing, this is extremely sensitive. Britain does work with Russia in terms of sharing intelligence and on international affairs, such as the fight against ISIS in Syria. And owing to these things, it's particularly difficult for Britain to be pointing the finger at Russia, as has happened today as a result of Sir Robert Owen's publication of his inquiry's findings, finally, after 10 years of discussions of what happened to Alexander Litvinenko.
Yes, you mentioned the importance London attributed to relations with Moscow. Do you expect Prime Minister Cameron to temper his reaction?
Well, so far it's been tough talk but little action. The government has been keen to point out that in 2007 it did expel some members of the embassy, the Russian embassy in London. But other than that, it doesn't seem like they're going to do very much. They've said that it's very important to weigh what has happened against the current dealings with Russia that Britain has to have. Of course, Litvinenko's widow says that it would be terrible if Britain didn't act decisively and strongly. She wants numerous people evicted from the embassy in the UK now, and she wants some restraints on them, freezing of their accounts and the like, for those who are directly implicated in the killing of her husband. But so far it seems that despite the Russian ambassador being summoned to the Foreign Office, despite the tough talk of Theresa May, the Home Secretary, in the House of Commons directly after the publication of the findings of the report, despite these things, it's not clear that much is actually going to happen, and it's not clear that the widow's wishes will be, in fact, coming true.
Jonathan, high-ranking Russian officials were presumably in the loop. Now, do you expect the findings of the inquiry could lead to indictments, including at the international level?
Well, the two people involved are, in fact, wanted for arrest by the Metropolitan Police, and that was reiterated as well today by the government and the Metropolitan Police themselves. There's almost no chance of them being sent over to the UK. Russia's made it very clear that that won't happen, certainly not under Vladimir Putin's leadership. In fact, he's helped protect them since the 2006 event, which actually saw them potentially poisoning, in fact, not potentially, now decidedly poisoning Litvinenko and killing him. Those people, maybe after Putin has gone in possibly, let's say, 10 years or more, maybe at that point there may be some move for them to be sent over to the UK for a trial. But before that, it doesn't seem likely at all. And it doesn't seem likely that Britain's going to get its way in terms of getting any kind of justice taking place and being seen to take place within the United Kingdom.
Yes, I24 News London correspondent Jonathan Sasha, thank you very much for that. Yes, and now to continue the discussion, I'm joined in studio by Paula Sleer, Middle East Bureau Chief of Russia Today. Good evening.
Good evening.
And Professor Emmanuel Navone, Professor of International Relations at Tel Aviv University. Good evening.
Good evening.
Paula, the inquiry found that, and I quote, the operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by the head of the security service in 2006 and also President Putin. How worrying is this for the Russian president?
Well, let me say that I don't think it's particularly worrying, that the finding was not a surprise, neither to the British side or to the Russian side. We've heard from a Kremlin spokesperson who has made reference of the word probably and possibly, which are words that came out in the finding, saying that this was an example of British humour. That's actually the quote. And that we're talking about a hearing that was held behind closed doors, that it was unnamed officials, undisclosed information. So the Russians are certainly not putting a lot of weight on that. We have also heard from the Russian Foreign Ministry saying that this was not a surprise, saying that it is a very politicized inquiry. However, they did express concern that this could potentially further weaken the relationship between Russia and the United Kingdom, which, let me say, is pretty weak already. There was a comment today by a member of parliament in Moscow saying that there wasn't actually any potential for the relationship between the two countries to get any worse.
It's a very important point because probably is what we've been hearing almost since Litvinenko passed in 2006. And we should remember Litvinenko was a British citizen. He was given citizenship shortly before his death, which means that if the inquiry's findings are correct, a British citizen was killed in London by who the inquiry says is Russian officials under Russian orders. This puts Cameron and the UK in a very tough spot.
Well, it puts also, obviously, the Russians on a very tough spot because they're the ones who are suspected of having committed this murder of a British citizen, a British subject. But I think that as far as the British Prime Minister is concerned, Jonathan Sassadoti said there's been a lot of tough talk and very little action. The question is the British government going to translate this tough talk into real action, such as economic sanctions? Or are there sanctions vis-à-vis the Russia? Now, we know there are already sanctions from the West because of the annexation of Crimea and the de facto annexation of eastern Ukraine. And the question is the UK going to promote more sanctions against Russia because of this suspected political crime?
And in fact, more sanctions is what Litvinenko's widow asked for today when the inquiry findings came out. We do know, of course, that the UK and Russia are involved in the Russian campaign against IS targets in Syria. It seemed like it would not be, as Jonathan mentioned before, in the UK's interest to take such actions as sanctions.
It certainly wouldn't. And I think if you look at Cameron's remarks, he wasn't actually, well, he was hedging his remarks to some extent. He did say that they were highly critical of Russia, not only because of this particular inquiry, but also because of, as you mentioned, Ukraine, Crimea, and certainly the very different opinions that Russia and the United Kingdom have in Syria. But Cameron did say that the two countries need to work together in terms of finding a solution in Syria. So he did temper his remarks, and I think that is an acknowledgement, as you say, that they need to work together in terms of dealing with the Syrian civil war and the crisis that is happening there.
Professor Navone, when Paula says that they need to work together, as Cameron said today, does this mean that maybe no one will be held accountable in the end?
Well, we have to remember that Russia is world power, and there's so much that a country like Britain can do against Russia. On the other hand, Russia is also vulnerable economically, because as John McCain once called Russia, it's basically a huge gas station. So it is very vulnerable because it's an economy that's basically based on its export of oil and natural gas. And that's why the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia by the West are biting already. So yes, Britain and the West do need Russia in order to try and find some kind of solution in Syria, for example. But Russia is also vulnerable to economic sanctions because it is very dependent on its exports of natural gas and oil.
Paula, would you agree? Not much to do against Russia in this regard?
I think the Russians are not expecting that a lot is going to happen. I don't think they're worried about that. You know, you're talking about sanctions. There are very significant sanctions that are already in place. And I think the Russians are feeling the brunt of that. The question is what further sanctions really can be put into place. The story is huge in Russian social media. It hasn't been covered as extensively in the mainstream Russian press. But I have been talking to Russian experts, and there are questions that the Russians are asking. For example, why was none of the evidence that was so-called used in this investigation made public? Why, if Litvinenko was living in London for 6 years, why did it take 6 years for the Russians presumably to assassinate him? They had opportunities to do it before. Remember, all of this happened at a time that Putin was much more popular. It was before Ukraine, it was before Crimea. So why would the Russian president have wanted to mar his reputation? So the Russians certainly are not buying into the British point of view. And when I say the Russians, I'm talking about neither the Russian government nor the Russian public by and large.
Still so many questions, and we'd love to have you both here back with us to discuss them further. Paula Sleer and Professor Emmanuel Navone, thank you very much for this tonight.
Thank you.
And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with U.S. Vice President Joe Biden and Secretary of State John Kerry today on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum Summit in Davos. This amid renewed tensions between Jerusalem and Washington. Eli Hochenberg, diplomatic correspondent for the News Today, reports.
It was far from being an easy week for Israel's diplomacy, especially when it comes to its shaky relations with its best ally, the United States. But on Thursday, Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu, currently taking part in the World Economic Forum in Davos, invested efforts in putting things back on the right track and sending messages of business as usual.
We can have our disagreements. We do. They're always publicized. They're very dramatic. But the alliance between the United States and Israel is so strong and so powerful that the only thing that's collapsed is the talk of the imminent American-Israeli collapse. It's very clear that's not going to happen, and that this partnership is rock solid.
Earlier on Thursday, Netanyahu met both U.S. Vice President Joe Biden and Secretary of State John Kerry, meetings that were defined as friendly and cordial and held in a great atmosphere in the case of Biden, or regarding the sit-down with Kerry as very good and private. But not only Washington was on the agenda, but the complex situation in the Middle Eastern neighborhood.
What will happen in Syria? Can a unitary Syrian state be put together again? I doubt it. I wish it could happen, but I'm not sure you could put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I'd say the best result you might be able to get is a benign, sort of benign Balkanization.
Yet amidst regional calamities, Jerusalem is seeking to seize opportunities and strengthen its position. Netanyahu even suggested that the European Union and its policies towards Israel, which are becoming more aggressive with every passing day, take an example from the prevailing understanding policies Arab nations in the Middle East show towards Israel, their traditional enemy. Alongside politics and diplomacy, Netanyahu also discussed technology and innovation, with a special emphasis on cybersecurity, a field in which Israel is one of the leading global nations.
Yes, let's join in a voice from Davos in Switzerland to our conversation. Eyal Avriel, chief editor of The Marker magazine. is not on the phone with us now, but we will try to get back to him later. In the meantime, in the studio, Professor Emmanuel Navone is still with us, and diplomatic correspondent for the News Today, Eli Hohenberg. Good evening, Eli.
Good evening, Ayman.
Eli, Netanyahu, of course, met with Kerry today in Davos, and this follows a very rough week for U.S.-Israel relations.
Indeed, a very, very rough week, and Netanyahu or his office tried to show that everything is okay, business as usual, and everything is even more better than ever. And we see press releases which uses, many superlatives, such as a highly positive meeting, a very private one, not necessarily a usual thing. And because of this very delicate situation, it is important for Jerusalem to present as things are again on the right track, but putting band-aids on a deep wound is not a good solution, and probably the next crisis between Jerusalem and Washington is imminent and unavoidable.
Speaking of a deep wound, Professor Navone, just yesterday Prime Minister Netanyahu said Israel is not what's wrong with the Middle East, it's what's right in the Middle East. Taking into consideration everything that he has to accomplish diplomatically in Davos, is he being too optimistic?
Well, there's definitely a lot of wrong things about the Middle East. As we know, it's definitely not the most stable region in the world. So I think on the one hand, he's right to remind the world that, the Middle East is the most messed up region in the world. And Israel is basically the only stable country in that region. But however, Israel is also in the middle of a 100-year conflict, which is still also unsolved. So that's also part of the story. In other words, both sides are true. Israel is indeed the only stable and strong country in this region, but it also has an unresolved conflict. And this, of course, he didn't mention because the American kept mentioning it. It looks like the current administration has mostly given up on trying to resolve this conflict, but it is there.
What is he likely to try to accomplish while in Davos, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu?
Davos is really a meeting with all the bigwigs of the world, politicians, business leaders, etc. So, of course, any leader has to go there. And when he goes to Davos, generally he tries to present Israel and to market Israel as the startup nation, as a technology powerhouse, and in terms of the geopolitics of the Middle East, as he said, the only stable region of the country, which is true. But again, around him there are other politicians, other political leaders, the European Union, the United States, that keep reminding him there's also the issue of the conflict. As I said, we do not know exactly if the Obama administration, which still has 1 year to go, has given it up or not, but we see that the European Union is taking many initiatives on that issue.
Well, let's try now to again bring in Eyal Avriel, the chief editor. No, he's still not with us, unfortunately. We will try to get that Davos call again. Eli, you have more highlights for us from Netanyahu's statements today.
Yes, well, when you have the Israeli Prime Minister on stage, no matter how flourishing the Israeli economy is, the talk goes back to diplomacy again. And he did mention a few very interesting things, where at the same week when implementation day of the Iranian nuclear deal took place, and Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif is also there, making his own victory lap. And Netanyahu said that, if I'm not mistaken, for the first time in a very sincere way, that he hopes that he's not wrong on the Iranian issue now that it is, underway and he has nothing to do about it. He says that he's, of course, still worried about the intentions of the Iranian regime, but he is hoping that he's wrong on this matter. We also have a deteriorating relationship between Jerusalem and Stockholm, and Netanyahu is sending, a short, small wink to Sweden, saying that there are more Swedish people joining IS than Israeli Arabs, and to finish that issue, he also, of course, addresses the Palestinian conflict, saying once again that he's calling on Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to meet to trigger the peace negotiations, and puts the blame on the Palestinian side.
Well, Professor Navone, taking into consideration everything Eli just told us, this is an economic forum, but it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu did not steer clear of the explosive issues.
Right, it is an economic forum, but of course it is attended by political leaders, and the two are related, as we know, when it comes to Israel, for example. indeed the strongest economy in the Middle East, but also a country that has an unresolved conflict. And as I said before, the two are related. And even when the Israeli Prime Minister wants to emphasize Israel's economic strength, which are real, there is an international community, or at least there are international players that do have their own agenda when it comes to that conflict. And especially, we just spoke about Sweden. I mean, one of the reasons why many European countries are trying to be so proactive regarding this conflict is because they perceive it as having repercussions on their own internal politics. So this is also part of the story when it comes to the relationship between Israel and the European Union.
But I wouldn't necessarily call the Swedish foreign minister statement as proactive. It's just condemnations and
no, but
blames.
I was talking more about the sanctions or the labeling policy that the EU has been initiating lately. I mean, I agree with you that those declarations do not represent the European Union, but there have been steps taken by...
And they are far from being proactive.
Right.
It's not an initiative or anything.
Right.
Yes. Well, we were unable to get that call from Davos, but Professor Emmanuel Navone, thank you for being with us tonight. Eli Hohenberg, you're staying with us for our next story. The Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas spoke to Israeli journalists this evening, revealing there was talk of him meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu over the last 2 months without U.S. mediation. Abbas claims the Israeli premier refused. It comes amid a push by the Palestinian Authority to advance a resolution in the UN Security Council that will declare Israeli settlements in the West Bank illegal under international law. Eli Hohenberg has more.
Only 3 days after the EU approved a resolution underlining the illegal status of Israeli settlements, the UN is adding some more pressure on Jerusalem. In light of reports on the Israeli government's intention to appropriate lands in the West Bank near Jericho, United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon released a condemnation, saying he is, quote, deeply concerned by the potential move. Settlement activities are a violation of international law and run counter to the public pronouncements of the government of Israel supporting a two-state solution to the conflict. Washington also reacted unhappily to the reports a short time after saying it also does not view European labeling of settlement products as a boycott.
I feel as though I sound like a broken record, but we strongly oppose any steps that could accelerate settlement expansion, and we believe they're fundamentally incompatible with a two-state solution and call into question, frankly, the Israeli government's commitment to a two-state solution.
Backed with this positive momentum, the Palestinian Authority, meanwhile, is attempting to promote a resolution at the UN Security Council to define West Bank settlements as illegal.
I think we should go to the Security Council with a resolution only and solely for the colonial settlement enterprise. We ask you to stop settlements. You ask them to stop settlement. They're not listening to you. They're not listening to Obama. They're not listening to Kerry. They're not listening to Merkel. They're not listening to anyone.
With condemnations, resolutions, and initiatives rapidly piling up, it seems that soon Israel will have no other choice but to present a proactive approach in regard to solving the conflict, or else diplomatic isolation becomes a fact on the ground.
Yes, and joining me and Eli Hohenberg in the studio now is Ashraf Al-Ajrami, former Palestinian minister. Good evening.
Good evening.
Well, Mr. Al-Ajrami, how secure can the Palestinian Authority be that the UN Security Council would even consider this resolution? It's a very explosive resolution, to say the least.
I think the Palestinian Authority is secure enough to go ahead with what they do now, because the situation is, especially the stability of the Palestinian Authority, is needed by the world. So I think the Israeli Authority must respond positively to the demands from the international community, from the European Union, from the United States of America, to stop the confiscation of the lands and the building of the settlements. It is somehow endanger the peace process, endanger the solution of two states if the Israeli government continues its policy to build everywhere and to confiscation of the land, the Palestinian territories in the Jordanian Valley and the heights of the West Bank and on all settlements separated everywhere. I think there is no chance to have a solution of two states, especially establishing a Palestinian independent state, 1967 borders, especially to have some kind of a viable Palestinian state.
And Ali, Mr. Al-Ajrami mentions the Israeli establishment and the Israeli government. How is the Israeli government likely to respond to this move by the Palestinian Authority?
Well, Israel is always highly against any unilateral moves by the Palestinian Authority, but it seems, that the rope is getting tighter no matter how much Jerusalem is willing to acknowledge. We see this EU decision to differentiate between West Bank settlements and Israel. We see the United States supporting not supporting, but not saying that the labeling the decision of the European Union from months ago is a boycott. And only today, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, visiting the Middle East, called for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So I really don't see any maneuverability for Israel unless taking a proactive steps towards coming back to the negotiating table. And Netanyahu was in Davos, as mentioned, and he was asked about this latest disputed matter. Let's hear what he had to say. And he also said a few words about their renewing ties with Turkey.
It's a land survey. It's one of many. It's routine, and I think it's not the issue. There's been no decision on what to do with this land, but there is a decision that I've made to negotiate peace with the Palestinian Authority if they deem to do so. I have an open call for them to start the negotiations, because that's how we're going to get to peace.
How is the process going with Turkey to normalize relations?
We're talking to them, and they're talking to us. And if we succeed, it'll be good for both countries.
Are you hopeful? Thank you very much.
We are always hopeful.
Sir, can I ask you?
Yes, Mr. Al-Ajrami, the Palestinian Authority is, of course, always also trying to acquire recognition for a Palestinian state internationally, but doesn't it already count on the U.S. vetoing this new resolution?
Yes, but we are in a situation that United States of America not so patient of the Israeli steps on the ground. So we can reach a situation that the Americans don't use the veto, that they can pass a resolution in the United Nations Security Council.
Yes.
And I think now the European Union and the whole international community.
Yes, we will keep following this. Ashraf Al-Ajrami and Eli Hochenberg, thank you very much. We are off for a 2-minute break and we'll be back. Stay with us.